March 22nd, 1945. 1340 hours. A requisitioned schoolhouse 3 kilometers west of the Rhine. 3 German officers sat in a room that still smelled of chalk dust and children's books. Outside, American MPs paced through mud churned by tank treads and artillery caissons. Inside, across a scarred wooden table, an American intelligence captain arranged photographs with the deliberate care of a man laying out evidence in a murder trial. The German major, career Wehrmacht, Iron Cross First Class pinned to a tunic that had seen 2 years of retreat, leaned forward when the first image slid across the table surface. The photograph showed an American general in full dress uniform, standing beside a Sherman tank, twin revolvers visible at his hips, their ivory handles catching sunlight like warnings. The captain asked if the German officer recognized the man. The major's response came without hesitation, without consultation with his fellow prisoners. Patton. Every officer on the Western Front knew that face. Every intelligence briefing included assessments of his location, his intentions, his next probable axis of advance. The major paused, selecting words with the caution of a man who understood he was confirming Allied suspicions, then finished his thought. The most dangerous American commander in the theater. The captain made a notation in his file, then produced a second photograph. This one showed an older man in a weathered field jacket, no rank insignia, no decorations, no indication of command authority. He stood beside an unmarked jeep eating an apple, looking like a logistics officer on a supply run rather than a 3-star general commanding an entire army. The question was simple. Did they recognize this man? The Germans studied the image. One shook his head. Another shrugged with the exhaustion of men who had spent months retreating and no longer trusted their assessments. The major offered a guess. Perhaps a colonel, perhaps a staff officer, certainly no one of significance. The American captain allowed himself a smile so slight it barely registered as expression. That photograph, he informed them, also showed Patton, taken 3 days prior, taken within 5 kilometers of where these officers had been captured. The German major stared at the photograph as though it had transformed into something incomprehensible, and in a sense it had. Everything in his training, everything in military doctrine, everything in the logic of command structure insisted this could not be accurate. Generals of Patton's rank traveled with security detachments, with command vehicles, with all the visible apparatus of authority that inspired troops and intimidated enemies. They did not drive to forward positions in unmarked jeeps. They did not present themselves as anonymous officers indistinguishable from 10,000 other men in field jackets. Unless, the captain explained, they wanted to reach the front without drawing fire. Unless they wanted to observe battlefield conditions firsthand without the complications of protocol and security theater. Unless they valued tactical awareness more than personal safety. The major examined the second photograph again, and the American officer watching him understood what was happening behind those eyes. A recalibration, a recognition that the enemy commander they feared most was even more unpredictable, even more dangerous than German intelligence had assessed. If this was true, if Patton genuinely operated at the front with minimal protection, then he possessed either courage beyond comprehension or a disregard for survival that bordered on pathology. According to the men who served under him, the captain said, closing his folder, Patton embodied both qualities simultaneously. And in that moment, in a schoolhouse west of the Rhine, the German major understood something that would appear in dozens of post-war interrogation reports. The Americans had fielded a general who fought like German doctrine taught generals to fight, who understood mobile warfare with the instincts of a panzer commander, and who terrified his enemies not merely through tactical brilliance, but through his refusal to behave like generals were supposed to behave. What followed in the final months of the war would confirm every fear German intelligence officers harbored about the man in both photographs, the one in dress uniform and the one eating an apple beside an unmarked jeep. They were the same man. And that contradiction, more than any tactical innovation, more than any operational breakthrough, would define why Patton's Third Army advanced faster, struck harder, and penetrated deeper than any other Allied formation in the European theater. Because you cannot predict a commander who refuses predictability. You cannot target a general who appears where generals should not be. And you cannot defend against an army led by a man who shares every danger he orders his soldiers to face. July 1944, Normandy, the Bocage country. Most Allied generals commanded from chateau headquarters 15 to 20 kilometers behind active fighting. They received reports via radio and courier. They studied maps annotated by intelligence officers. They made decisions based on information that was often hours old by the time it reached them, filtered through multiple layers of subordinate command, sanitized of chaos and uncertainty. Patton considered this arrangement tactically insane and personally unacceptable. Third Army officers learned within days of the formation's activation that their commanding general possessed what they initially interpreted as a dangerous habit, but gradually came to understand as deliberate operational philosophy. He appeared at forward positions without warning, without the security detachment that doctrine demanded, without any of the visible markers that identified a three-star general. A lieutenant directing traffic at a crossroads during a breakout from Normandy looked up to find an unmarked jeep idling beside him, an older man in a plain field jacket asking where the front line was positioned. The lieutenant pointed north, adding that German artillery was actively interdicting that road, that shells had landed within the past 10 minutes, that traveling forward was inadvisable for anyone without immediate tactical necessity. The man in the field jacket said that sounded exactly where he needed to go. Only when the lieutenant noticed the ivory-handled revolvers did recognition arrive like an electric shock. He asked if the man was General Patton. The response came casually, almost dismissively. Last time he checked. Then the jeep accelerated toward the sound of artillery, leaving the lieutenant staring after it with an expression combining disbelief and something approaching awe. The pattern repeated itself daily throughout Third Army's operational area. Patton drove to forward positions, observed conditions personally, spoke with frontline soldiers, and departed before anyone could organize proper security or protocol. His staff officers mounted continuous campaigns to modify this behavior. His chief of staff argued that losing the commander to random German fire would create catastrophic command disruption. His security detachment commander pointed out that a single sniper, a single artillery shell, a single unlucky moment could decapitate Third Army's leadership. Patton listened to these arguments with the patience of a man who had already made his decision and was merely allowing subordinates to exhaust their objections. Then he explained his reasoning, and that reasoning revealed a philosophy of command that contradicted everything taught in staff colleges, but aligned perfectly with how wars were actually fought and won. Soldiers, he insisted, needed to know their commander shared their danger, not abstractly, not theoretically, not through carefully staged visits to rear area positions. They needed to see him in the mud, under fire, exposed to the same steel and explosives that could kill them. Because fear was contagious, and so was courage. If they believed their general sat in safety while ordering them into death, morale would fracture. But if they knew, truly knew from direct observation that he went forward into the same chaos he asked them to enter, they would follow him through conditions that would break other formations. His staff understood the logic. They simply believed the risk outweighed the benefit. Patton believed the benefit was so overwhelming that risk became irrelevant. He continued appearing at forward positions throughout the summer of 1944, throughout the autumn battles in Lorraine, throughout the winter crisis in the Ardennes, throughout the spring advance into Germany. And gradually, inevitably, German intelligence officers trying to track his movements confronted a problem that violated every assumption about how enemy commanders operated. They could not locate him. September 1944, German 7th Army headquarters, somewhere east of Nancy. Intelligence officers assembled reports like archaeologists reconstructing a shattered artifact from fragments. Patton was confirmed at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy at 0900 hours. 2 hours later, forward reconnaissance elements reported an American general matching his description near Metz, 40 kilometers north. That same afternoon, a different unit reported him near Saarbrücken, 70 kilometers east. The following morning, he was back in Nancy. The mathematics of these movements seemed impossible. The distances, the timing, the complete absence of command convoys that should accompany a formation commander, none of it aligned with how generals operated. A German intelligence major presented his superior with 3 possibilities. First, the reports were mistaken, and soldiers under pressure were misidentifying random American officers as Patton. Second, Patton was using doubles, presenting multiple false versions of himself to confuse German tracking efforts. Third, he was actually traveling with minimal security to forward positions, moving faster than German intelligence could track, appearing and disappearing like a phantom. The superior officer studied the accumulated reports, cross-referenced them with prisoner interrogations and intercepted radio traffic, then reached a conclusion that disturbed him precisely because it contradicted doctrine. The third possibility was correct. Patton was personally conducting forward reconnaissance, traveling in unmarked vehicles, deliberately making himself difficult to track and target, which meant German intelligence faced a problem without precedent in their experience. Allied generals were predictable. Montgomery required elaborate preparation before any offensive, giving German defenders time to reinforce threatened sectors. Bradley was competent but conventional, following established doctrine. Eisenhower was a coordinator, not a field commander. But Patton operated outside predictable patterns. He made decisions at the speed of observation rather than the speed of reports filtering up command chains. He identified opportunities while they still existed, rather than hours after they had closed. He understood terrain and enemy dispositions through direct observation rather than map study. This gave him an operational tempo that German forces, already stretched thin and fighting on multiple fronts, could not match. The intelligence major asked his superior how they should respond to this assessment. The answer came with the weariness of a man who recognized a problem without solution. They should avoid engaging Third Army wherever alternative options existed. Because Patton's unpredictability, combined with his willingness to take personal risks that enabled faster decision-making, created a tactical advantage that German forces could not counter without committing disproportionate resources. The report was filed. Copies went to higher headquarters, and in situation rooms across the German defensive network, staff officers began tracking Patton with the obsessive attention normally reserved for strategic threats like bomber formations and army-level offensives. They feared him more than they feared entire divisions under other commanders, because divisions could be predicted, countered, contained. But a general who appeared at the front without warning, who made decisions in real time, who seemed to value speed and aggression over personal survival, that was an opponent for whom German doctrine provided no adequate response. And then December arrived, and Patton demonstrated exactly why German intelligence officers had been correct to fear him. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes, 0530 hours. German forces erupted through American lines in the largest offensive the Wehrmacht would mount in the war's final year. 24 divisions, 200,000 men, hundreds of panzers and assault guns, all aimed at a thinly defended sector held by inexperienced American units and formations recovering from earlier battles. The plan was ambitious, perhaps desperate. Split the Allied armies, drive to Antwerp, force a political settlement in the West that would allow Germany to concentrate forces against the Soviet advance in the East. Within 48 hours, German spearheads had penetrated 50 kilometers. American units retreated in disorder. Communication networks fractured. Command structures collapsed, and the critical road junction at Bastogne, held by elements of the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition and medical supplies, became the hinge upon which the entire German offensive would turn. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied commanders convened emergency conferences. Montgomery wanted weeks to organize a methodical counteroffensive. Bradley advocated defensive consolidation before attempting relief operations. Staff officers drafted plans requiring 10 days minimum for major troop redeployments, and Patton, attending these conferences at Eisenhower's headquarters, told them he could attack north in 48 hours. The room went silent. Attacking north required pivoting Third Army 90 degrees from its current offensive into the Saar region, reorienting an entire army group, coordinating logistics across fractured supply networks, and launching a major offensive through winter conditions that had grounded air support and turned roads into frozen mud tracks. Staff officers explained patiently that such a maneuver required a week at minimum, more realistically 10 days, possibly 2 weeks given weather and terrain. Patton told them he had already issued preliminary movement orders. His staff had wargamed exactly this scenario weeks earlier. The plans existed, the coordination was possible, and if they wanted to relieve Bastogne before it fell, before the German offensive achieved operational success, before the initiative shifted irreversibly, they needed to move now. Eisenhower studied Patton across the conference table, and in that moment he made the decision that would define the Battle of the Bulge's outcome. He authorized Third Army's immediate attack north. What followed became one of the war's most remarkable operational achievements, and it began with Patton doing exactly what German intelligence officers knew he would do and still could not counter. He went to the front. December 22, 1944, Southern Belgium, late afternoon. Third Army's advance north moved through conditions that reduced warfare to its most primitive elements. Snow fell continuously. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Roads became ice sheets that sent tanks sliding into ditches. Visibility dropped to meters. Radio communications fractured in the cold. And through this frozen chaos, Patton's forces advanced at a pace that seemed impossible to German defenders who had expected any American counterattack to take weeks to organize. Because Patton was not organizing the attack from headquarters 20 kilometers behind the advance, he was with the lead elements in an unmarked jeep, moving from battalion to battalion, making decisions in real time as opportunities emerged and obstacles appeared. A tank battalion commander found himself stalled at a crossroads, uncertain which route offered the best approach to Bastogne, when an older man in a field jacket appeared beside his Sherman and asked why they had stopped moving. The battalion commander explained the tactical problem: 2 possible routes, incomplete intelligence about German positions, risk of driving into prepared defenses. The man in the field jacket studied the map for perhaps 30 seconds, then pointed to the western route and told the battalion commander to take it immediately, at maximum speed, accepting risk because speed was more valuable than security in this situation. The battalion commander asked who was issuing this order. The man smiled slightly and asked if the ivory-handled revolvers were sufficient identification. They were. The battalion took the western route. It reached Bastogne's perimeter 36 hours later, punching through the German encirclement and opening a corridor that allowed supplies and reinforcements to flow into the besieged town. December 26, 1944, 16:45 hours. A Sherman from the 4th Armored Division made contact with defenders from the 101st Airborne inside Bastogne's perimeter. The siege was broken. The German offensive's southern shoulder had been stopped,
and Third Army had achieved in 10 days what Allied planners had estimated would require a month. German intelligence officers analyzing the relief operation in subsequent reports focused obsessively on one factor. Patton's personal presence at the front enabled decision-making at a tempo they could not match. While German commanders waited for orders to filter through command hierarchies, Patton was issuing directives directly to battalion and company commanders, cutting through bureaucracy through the simple expedient of being present where decisions needed to be made.
This was not conventional command practice. It was not taught in military academies. It violated protocols designed to protect senior commanders from unnecessary risk, and it worked with devastating effectiveness. Because in modern warfare, tempo kills. The force that can observe, decide, and act faster than its opponent will win engagements regardless of other factors. And Patton, through his willingness to operate at the front, had achieved a tempo advantage that German forces could not overcome. But tempo carried costs, and those costs were measured in proximity to death. November 1944, Metz region, mid-afternoon. Patton's jeep was moving through a recently captured town when rifle fire erupted from a partially collapsed building. The driver reacted instantly, braking hard, preparing to reverse away from the threat. But Patton stood up in the jeep, drew one of his ivory-handled revolvers, and fired multiple rounds toward the source of the incoming fire, while shouting in German for the sniper to show himself and try again. His aide crouched in the back seat, would later report that one round passed close enough to Patton's head that his hair moved in the bullet's wake. Patton never acknowledged this near miss. He continued shooting until his pistol was empty, then shouted additional challenges toward the building until American infantry captured the sniper, a teenage boy so terrified he surrendered without resistance. When his aide asked why Patton had not taken cover, the general's response was immediate. Fear was contagious, but so was courage. If his soldiers saw him react with fear, they would absorb it. If they saw aggression, they would mirror it. Leadership was performative, demonstrated through action. His aide pointed out the obvious. Complete disregard for personal safety would eventually result in death. Patton said every man at the front faced that possibility. He would not ask soldiers to confront dangers he avoided himself. This created loyalty that bordered on religious devotion. His soldiers would attempt missions other units refused, advance through conditions that should have stopped them, maintain offensive operations when exhaustion should have forced consolidation. Their commander demonstrably shared every risk he asked them to accept. His staff mounted continuous campaigns to increase security and limit forward travel. Every campaign failed. Patton understood that in mobile operations, the commander who could observe directly and decide immediately possessed overwhelming advantage. That advantage was worth the personal risk. The risk was the source of the advantage itself. German intelligence officers reached the same conclusion from the opposite perspective. They knew his forward pattern made him vulnerable, but his unpredictability made targeting him nearly impossible. By the time they identified his location, he had already moved. By the time they organized responses, he was 20 kilometers away, making those responses irrelevant. And then March arrived, and the Rhine, and an incident that would crystallize everything about Patton's command philosophy into a single symbolic action. March 7, 1945, Remagen, 1600 hours. The Ludendorff Bridge should not have been standing. German engineers had planted demolition charges. Retreat protocols demanded its destruction before American forces could reach it. But a combination of damaged detonators, communication failures, and the sheer speed of the American advance left it intact when forward elements of the 9th Armored Division reached the western bank.
What followed was an 18-day race to move as many Allied forces across the Rhine as possible before the damaged bridge collapsed or German counterattacks destroyed it. Engineers worked continuously under German artillery fire and airstrikes to reinforce the structure. Infantry and armor streamed across, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank. And Patton, upon learning that American forces had secured a crossing, immediately drove to Remagen. He arrived to find engineers frantically shoring up damaged sections, while German shells landed in the river, sending up columns of water. Officers warned him the structure could collapse at any moment, that German forces were targeting it with everything available. This served no tactical purpose. His presence would not accelerate the crossing, would not improve defenses, would not alter operational outcomes. His staff was horrified. The bridge was the most dangerous location in the entire European theater at that specific moment. Patton walked onto it anyway. He reached the center span and stood there for several minutes while artillery rounds impacted the water around him. Soldiers crossing with ammunition and supplies slowed to stare in disbelief, their army commander standing calmly in the middle of the most heavily targeted structure on the Western Front, apparently unconcerned that a single shell could end his life. Then he crossed to the eastern bank, stepped onto German soil for the first time, unzipped his trousers and urinated into the Rhine River. He announced to the soldiers nearby that he had been waiting years for that particular moment. Then he walked back across the bridge, still under fire, still exposed, climbed into his jeep, and departed. The incident spread through Third Army within hours. Their commanding general had stood on a bridge the Germans were actively trying to destroy, crossed into Germany under artillery fire, pissed in the Rhine as a gesture of contempt, and walked away as though taking a casual stroll. This contributed nothing to tactical success. It enabled no operational advantage. What it provided was something conventional analysis struggles to quantify. It gave his soldiers confirmation that he embodied the aggression and fearlessness he demanded from them. And in warfare, where morale often matters more than equipment, that symbolic gesture was worth more than any number of conventional command decisions made from headquarters safety. April 1945. Germany. The final collapse. German intelligence files captured after the surrender contained hundreds of pages devoted to Allied commanders. Montgomery's sections detailed his requirement for overwhelming preparation before offensive operations. Bradley's files noted his competent but predictable approach. Eisenhower's assessment focused on his role as a coordinator rather than a tactical commander. Patton's file was different. It was longer, more detailed, and annotated with observations that read less like military intelligence and more like attempts to understand a phenomenon that violated every assumption about how modern generals operated. German intelligence officers had tracked his movements obsessively throughout the campaign. They had interviewed prisoners who had encountered him. They had analyzed his operational patterns. And their conclusion, in the careful language of professional military assessment, but carrying an undercurrent of something approaching fear, was unambiguous. Patton represented the most dangerous Allied commander in the theater, not because his tactical abilities exceeded other generals, though they were exceptional, but because he was unpredictable, aggressive beyond normal parameters, and apparently unconcerned with personal survival. One report included a margin notation that would be discovered by American officers sorting through captured documents. Thank God there was only one of him. Because German forces, stretched across multiple fronts, fighting coalition enemies with industrial capacity they could not match, dependent on rigid doctrinal approaches that worked brilliantly when everything went according to plan, but collapsed under improvisation and chaos, they could not counter a commander like Patton. They could not predict where he would strike. They could not target him because he refused to maintain predictable patterns. They could not match his operational tempo because he made decisions at the speed of direct observation rather than at the speed of filtered reports. In post-war interrogations, German generals were asked which Allied commander they feared most. Almost unanimously, they answered Patton, not Montgomery, despite his methodical competence, not Bradley, despite his solid generalship, not Eisenhower, despite his strategic authority. They feared Patton because he fought the way German doctrine taught their own generals to fight, aggressively, opportunistically, with an understanding that modern warfare rewarded speed and initiative over caution and preparation.
One German general, asked to explain this assessment in detail, pointed out that German military philosophy emphasized getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, moving faster than opponents could observe and respond, creating chaos that prevented coordinated defensive responses. Patton, more than any other Allied commander, demonstrated those principles. He created chaos. He moved at speeds that prevented coherent German responses. He exploited opportunities before they closed. And he did it by being present at the front, observing conditions directly, making decisions in real time, cutting through the bureaucracy that slowed conventional command structures. The German general paused, then added something that would appear in multiple interrogation reports. Patton's approach should have gotten him killed. The personal risks he accepted should have been fatal. But his unpredictability, his minimal security signature, and perhaps simple fortune kept him alive. And every day he survived gave his forces a tempo advantage that German commanders could not overcome. May 8, 1945. Germany. Czechoslovakia border region. Germany surrendered. The announcement came via radio to units scattered across the disintegrating Reich. Soldiers celebrated, cried, processed the reality that they had survived, that the war in Europe was finished, that they could go home. Patton stood with a tank unit when the news arrived, watching his soldiers react to victory, and his expression betrayed nothing resembling celebration. An aide asked if he was all right. Patton said he was fine, but his voice carried a flatness that suggested otherwise. This had been his last war, he said quietly, in a moment of reflection that his aide would remember decades later. He was too old for whatever conflicts would follow. This had been his purpose, and now it was finished. The aide attempted reassurance, pointing out that Patton had saved thousands of lives, that his aggressive operations had shortened the war by months, that his contributions to victory were immeasurable. Patton acknowledged this with a slight nod, but his question remained unanswered. What does a warrior do when there are no more wars to fight? 7 months later, December 1945, Patton died in a hospital in Heidelberg from injuries sustained in a minor traffic accident. His Jeep had collided with a truck on a quiet road. The warrior who had survived years of frontline exposure, who had stood on bridges under artillery fire, who had dared German snipers to shoot him, who had taken personal risks that should have killed him dozens of times, he died in a car accident during peacetime. His driver said it felt wrong, that a man like Patton deserved a warrior's death, a battlefield ending, something that matched the life he had lived. Instead, he got a broken neck on a peaceful road, death arriving not with fire and steel, but with chance and misfortune. Perhaps that was the final irony. Perhaps that was the universe's last commentary on a man who had spent decades daring death to take him in combat. Perhaps it was simply random, meaningless, the kind of accident that kills thousands of people who never stood on bridges under fire, or challenged snipers, or walked calmly through artillery barrages. But for the soldiers who had served under him, who had seen him appear at the front when he should have been at headquarters, who had watched him share dangers he could have avoided, who had followed him through campaigns that seemed impossible until his presence made them achievable, for those soldiers, Patton's death felt like a betrayal of narrative logic. Heroes were not supposed to die in traffic accidents. Warriors were not supposed to survive years of combat only to fall to peacetime chance.
Yet history rarely provides satisfying endings. It provides endings that happen, whether they fit expected patterns or not. What Patton demonstrated through his reckless, aggressive, seemingly suicidal approach to command was a principle that modern military theory would eventually codify, but which he understood instinctively. In warfare, tempo is decisive. The force that can observe conditions, make decisions, and execute actions faster than its opponent will win regardless of other factors. Equipment matters, training matters, logistics matter. But tempo, the speed at which an organization moves through the observe-decide-act cycle, matters more. Conventional command structures slow tempo. Reports filter through communication networks. Analysis happens at headquarters. Decisions get made by officers studying maps rather than observing terrain. Orders travel back down communication chains to executing units. The entire process consumes time, and in mobile warfare, time is the resource that matters most. Patton bypassed that entire structure by being present where decisions needed to be made. He observed conditions directly. He made decisions on the spot. He issued orders to the units that would execute them, eliminating multiple layers of communication delay. This gave Third Army a tempo advantage that German commanders could not match. But that tempo advantage required Patton to accept personal risks that violated every protocol designed to protect senior commanders. It required him to operate at the front, where artillery and small arms fire could kill him as easily as they killed privates. It required him to travel in unmarked vehicles without significant security. It required him to expose himself to dangers that his staff officers found terrifying and German intelligence officers found incomprehensible. He accepted those risks because he understood that the alternative, commanding from safety while his soldiers died in forward positions, would destroy the morale and cohesion that enabled his formations to maintain offensive operations under conditions that broke other units. Soldiers fight harder for commanders they believe share their danger. They accept greater risks for leaders who demonstrate rather than merely demand courage. They maintain unit cohesion even under catastrophic pressure if they trust their commander understands their experience because he shares it. This was not theoretical for Patton. This was not abstract leadership philosophy. This was concrete practice, demonstrated daily, performed through actions that his soldiers witnessed and remembered and repeated in stories that spread through entire divisions. When German intelligence officers attempted to track him, they were not simply monitoring an enemy commander's location. They were trying to predict the movements of a general who had weaponized his own unpredictability, who understood that being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously created a tempo advantage worth more than any tactical innovation. When captured German officers were shown photographs of Patton at forward positions and expressed disbelief, they were not simply surprised by his presence. They were confronting evidence that contradicted their understanding of how modern warfare worked, how commanders operated, how military hierarchies functioned. When German generals said after the war that they feared Patton more than any other Allied commander, they were not offering subjective opinion. They were providing professional assessment based on their experience fighting against him, analyzing his methods, and recognizing that his approach created problems for which German doctrine provided no adequate solution. He was a conventional commander in some respects, brilliant with armor tactics, aggressive in pursuit, relentless in exploitation of enemy weakness, but he was profoundly unconventional in his willingness to operate outside the safety and predictability that other generals accepted as necessary components of senior command. That unconventionality terrified the Germans more than any tank or aircraft, because technology could be countered, tactics could be predicted, operations could be analyzed, and responses could be prepared. But a commander who refused to behave like commanders were supposed to behave, who appeared where he should not be, who made decisions faster than conventional command structures allowed, that was an opponent for whom no preparation was adequate. German intelligence devoted more resources to tracking Patton than to any other Allied commander. They built extensive files on his patterns, his tendencies, his operational preferences. They interviewed prisoners who had encountered him. They analyzed his communications. They attempted to predict his movements and intentions. And still, throughout the campaign, from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, they could not solve the problem he represented. Because the problem was not tactical, it was not operational, it was fundamental. How do you fight a commander who has weaponized his own unpredictability and whose presence at the front enables a tempo you cannot match? They never solved it. The war ended before they found an answer. And in the files they left behind, in the margin notes and assessments and interrogation transcripts, one truth emerged clearly. They were grateful there had been only one Patton. Because if the Allies had fielded multiple commanders with his aggressive instincts, his tempo advantages, his willingness to take personal risks in service of operational success, the war would have ended even sooner. One German officer wrote in a captured document that Patton represented what German military philosophy aspired to produce: a general who understood mobile warfare instinctively, who could make decisions at the speed of combat, who led from the front rather than from safety. The irony, the officer noted, was that Germany had spent decades developing doctrine to create such commanders, while America had produced one seemingly by accident, a man whose personality and instincts aligned perfectly with what modern warfare rewarded. Whether Patton was brave or insane, whether his methods were brilliant or reckless, whether his survival was skill or fortune, these questions generated debate among historians and military theorists for decades after his death. But for the soldiers who served under him and the enemies who fought against him, the assessment was simpler and more immediate. He was dangerous. He was unpredictable. He was everywhere they did not expect him to be. And in warfare, where psychological advantage often matters as much as material superiority, that made him the most feared Allied commander on the Western Front, not despite his reckless disregard for personal safety, but because of it. Because that recklessness enabled the presence, that enabled the tempo, that enabled the victories that ended the war months sooner than it might have ended otherwise. And thousands of soldiers who might have died in those additional months survived instead. That was Patton's legacy, written not in official histories or strategic assessments, but in the lives of men who went home because the war ended sooner. A legacy built on fear. The fear German commanders felt when they learned he was coming, and the complete absence of fear in the man himself, standing on bridges under fire, walking through artillery strikes, daring death to claim him while he finished one last war before time ran out.